Thank you all for joining us. We're so appreciative of the community that has been gathering around this seminar. So welcome to our fall Women in Public Policy Program Research Seminar Series. We are focused this fall on intersectional perspectives on gender in negotiation. I'm Hannah Riley Bowles. I wear multiple hats at the Kennedy School, but I'm here in my capacity as the co-director of the Women in Public Policy Program at WAP, as we call ourselves. Our mission is to equip leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. And we are very grateful that this seminar is being co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, which is an inter-university consortium among Harvard, MIT, and Tufts, dedicated to connecting rigorous research and scholarship with deep understanding of practice. So I'd love to call out my co-organizers from the Program on Negotiation Research Lab, Jared Curhan, the Gordon Kaufman Professor and a Professor of Work and Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and Julian Zlatev, an Assistant Professor of Business Administration at the Negotiation Organizations and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School. Before we get started, I would like to offer a virtual land acknowledgement to honor Indigenous communities on the land where Harvard University sits, which is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people, the surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and of the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts. Today, transitioning to introducing our speaker, today we have Professor Ashley Whillans from the Harvard Business School presenting on gender and socioeconomic status in the willingness to ask for time and intangible support, particularly in educational and in work and educational environments. So Ashley is an assistant professor in the Negotiation Organizations and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School, a colleague of Julian's. She teaches motivation and incentives. Her research focuses on workplace rewards and decisions about time and money and how those affect employee motivation and well-being. She explores how identity factors such as gender and socioeconomic status influence the willingness to ask for time, and then also organizational interventions that enable people to access enable everyone to fully access resources like time, which are critical to productivity. In 2016 and 2018, Professor Whillans was named a rising star in behavioral science from the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. In 2022, she won an Emerging Career Trajectory Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and her research is widely published in top academic journals and media outlets, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. So Professor Whillans is going to start out with her presentation. She is open to clarifying questions. I will carefully watch the chat box for those. But ideally, she's going to get through her presentation and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So please join me in welcoming Ashley. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited about your presentation.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me today. So I'm going to be sharing some of my work, or the work that's kind of been inspiring this broader investigation, first focusing on the relationship between gender and willingness to ask for more time in the workplace and in educational settings, as Hannah was mentioning. Then I'm going to zoom out and provide a little bit of more exploratory analysis from some new work looking at SES and gender and how those two factors play a role in willingness to ask for time and support. So I became interested in this question of how gender and other identities that people might hold might predict the willingness to ask for more time out of my broader conceptual interest in understanding the relationship between time and happiness. So I study as a social psychologist the psychological experience of time poverty, or the feeling of having too many things to do in a day and not enough time to do them. If you're nodding along, thinking that definition seems familiar to you, you're not alone. In some of my data, 80% of working adults report feeling time poor, like they have too many things to do in a day and not enough time to do them. And we've reviewed evidence suggesting that the psychological experience of time poverty can have strong negative effects on happiness. In one data set of 3 million Americans, we found that time poverty had a stronger negative effect on subjective well-being than being unemployed. We can see that stress is also on the rise worldwide. So this is not just a North American or US phenomena. So looking at data from the Gallup World Poll, my colleagues and I analyzed, we see that the proportion of working adults who reported experiencing a lot of stress yesterday has significantly increased between 2005 and 2020. We can see that these trends are strongest in North American context. So in the US, along this time horizon, we see that the percentage of working adults who reported experiencing a lot of stress yesterday increased from 40% to nearly 55%. And when we unpack the data, we see that one of the strongest predictors of these increased feelings of time stress are work-related demands. And we review the literature and really do suggest that these feelings of time stress driven by work-related demands have a strong negative effect on subjective well-being, and in particular are especially negative for the subjective well-being of women. Probably heard a lot about this research during the COVID-19 pandemic, and maybe this was consistent with your experience as well, but I've also been looking at how time, stress, and well-being has changed as a function of the COVID-19 pandemic. So on the one hand, it's possible that COVID-19, because we're now working in a more flexible manner, has increased the amount of time affluence or time control people feel like they have. But on the other hand, given that we now have more meetings, more digital distraction, and might have less segmentation between work and home, it's possible that time stress has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the data actually suggests that our time demands and our perceptions of stress have increased as opposed to decreased as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Objective data from Microsoft, this was conducted by one of my colleagues, or two of my colleagues, Jeff Polzer and Rafaela Sandoun. They took all of Microsoft objective data from Teams, calendar invites, emails, and showed that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the workday expanded by about 8.2%, or about the amount of time that we used to spend commuting to the office, in a perfect example of Parkinson's law, where work is expanding to fill the additional time we can give it. These trends have persisted coming out of the pandemic, with Microsoft reporting that meetings have gone up 250% and stayed there even as offices have come back into a more hybrid way of working. And 30% more knowledge workers are now working a third shift between 7 to 10 p.m. to make up for the digital distraction that's happening during the day as a result of additional emails and meetings. We also published a work during the COVID-19 pandemic showing, unsurprisingly and consistent with a lot of other evidence, that these time demands and time burdens, both prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, were not equally distributed between men and women. So in our data, which was a large data set of over 30,000 employees who were working from home during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that women took on more chores and childcare while working remotely. That amounted to 12 more days of chores and 6 fewer days of active leisure in 2021. And this negatively impacted their well-being. This is consistent with other evidence conducted prior to the pandemic, suggesting that women tend to take on more chores and childcare. So stepping back and thinking more broadly about the psychological experience of time stress, we see that women experience time stress and lower well-being more acutely, in part due to additional chores and childcare burdens, and that these differences between men and women have gotten larger coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when thinking from an organizational context, why time matters, we know that time stress and work-related demands can have a negative effect on employee well-being. And it seems particularly true right now in this moment. So about 6 months ago, and we've been doing this survey kind of repeatedly now, we surveyed employees and asked them what were their top 3 most important predictors of employee engagement and willingness to stay in their organization. The top most important predictor in the survey that we conducted was meaning and purpose. The second most important was personal empowerment, feeling like you had choice or autonomy over the various aspects of work. And the third, which was surprising to me, even as a time affluence and happiness researcher, was time affluence, the extent to which your organization was supporting you and feeling like you had control over your time. These three factors mattered more in our data than other factors that we know can predict employee engagement, like psych safety, having a boss you like, and even perceptions of fair pay. So we see that time burdens can have significant negative effects for subjective well-being, that working women experience them to a greater extent, in part because of increased chore demands, and that time affluence, or thinking about organizational policies that might help offset the time stress that all employees and especially women face, might be an especially important attraction and retention point for organizations in the current moment that we're in. Now, women are not only taking on more chores and childcare, but of course, and I know you have some upcoming speakers that are going to talk a lot more about this, but also within the workplace, women are both volunteered to do and accept more administrative and non-promotable tasks than men, meaning that they often have more time demands at work. And women also report on average feeling less comfortable delegating tasks to others, which also results in greater time stress due to work-related demands. So building on all of this research, we became interested in understanding whether another unexplored factor related to negotiations that might impact the extent to which women feel stressed and burnt out at work might be their reticence to ask for more time, even on clearly adjustable deadlines at work. So deadlines are one of the critical factors in organizations that make employees feel stressed out. Now, on one hand, deadlines are great because they help us accomplish our tasks. They make sure our talk slides get done, that our research papers get written. And so they have an important behavioral element that they encourage us to get work done. However, they do often come at a cost of stress and happiness for employees. And again, this level of stress and unhappiness is not equally distributed already in the employee population. And many of our deadlines are not actually firm deadlines, they're adjustable deadlines. So for example, a supervisor might ask an employee to submit an initial draft proposal for an event that's happening next month by the end of this week, to build in time to edit and revise the proposal before the final deadline. So given the volume of tasks that women disproportionately juggle at work and outside of it, requests to extend deadlines, especially deadlines that are explicitly adjustable and relatively costless, could be an unexplored and useful strategy for reducing time stress and burnout for working women. Indeed, we do see that the majority, or many, not the majority, a slight minority of deadlines that employees in knowledge work professions in particular experience are in fact adjustable, as we reported in another paper for another purpose. And so a lot of our deadlines are adjustable. And so could this be an overlooked and possibly beneficial route to helping women in this first investigation, I'll talk more broadly later, manage their multiple competing demands at work and outside of it. Despite the fact that women might experience the benefits of asking for more time to a greater extent, again, because they're taking on more demands at work and outside of it, it's also possible that women will be less likely to ask for more time, even on clearly adjustable deadlines at work. Women tend to be more relationally oriented and sensitive to the needs of other people as compared to men. Women often endorse more relationally oriented traits, such as sacrificing their own needs to attend to the needs of others, both voluntarily and in response to social pressure. And so as a result, we might also expect women to ask less, even if they could stand to benefit more. So in this first project, we're really trying to understand whether women are less likely to ask for more time, in part because they tend to be more relationally oriented and they might infer a higher impression cost. So we're going to test this assumption across a series of studies. We're also going to look at whether any of women's fears about the negative repercussions of asking for more time are well-founded by looking at the manager's perspective. And then we're going to look toward an organizational policy that might offset some of these negative fear of evaluation that women might have for asking for more time. And then specifically, we're going to build on the negotiations, the salary negotiations literature, and look at whether removing ambiguity vis-a-vis a clear formal policy that it's okay to ask for more time on a deadline in a school context can eliminate any of the observed gender difference that we see in our earlier studies. We've conducted a total of 14 studies, slightly more at this point, I think, but I'm not going to report all of those here. I'm just really going to focus at a high level across the studies, across 5 studies here. So in our first survey, we really just wanted to look at whether there might be gender differences in how comfortable men and women feel about making extension requests for adjustable deadlines at work. We looked at subsequent outcomes that I was talking about at the beginning of this presentation related to well-being and burnout. So we looked at whether we looked at outcomes like time stress and also perceptions of burnout, and our main predictor was gender. We also included a host of controls that could otherwise explain these relationships, like industry, occupational prestige, age, marital status, race, attitudes toward delegating tasks. As I mentioned, women feel less comfortable delegating, so we wanted to hold that constant and see if there was any unique effect of gender on extension request avoidance. So here, what we see consistent with the idea that women could potentially stand to benefit most, but also feel more concerned about asking for more time, is that there's a negative association. So women feel less comfortable asking for more time, even on clearly adjustable deadlines in the workplace. And these results hold controlling for a series of covariates. We also saw, consistent with some of my own and other research in this area, that women reported higher levels of burnout. They also reported higher levels of time stress. And when we fit a path model from these correlational data, so we have to take with a grain of salt that this is all correlational data, but the best fitting path was that women feel less comfortable asking for more time, which in turn predicts higher levels of time stress and higher levels of burnout. And when we fit this model, we see that the link between gender and burnout significantly reduces. And so we can gain some understanding that the discomfort with asking for more time on adjustable deadlines might be an unexplored factor, previously unexplored factor that might contribute to burnout and time stress for working women. Now, of course, there could be a variety of different occupational differences. Men and women could be thinking about different deadlines that have different levels of seriousness and less control. And so we can't really rule those factors out in the design of study 1, so that we then move to more tightly controlled paradigms to try to isolate the effect of gender on extension request discomfort, and also try to understand what are the specific mechanisms that might be driving this discomfort with asking for more time. And that's a great question, Jared, and I'll definitely come back to it. I'm just looking at the chat window. I'm like looking forward to having this conversation about like short-term, long-term trade-offs. So in our study 2, we just created a simulated workplace scenario that was more tightly controlled to rule out some of these alternative possibilities. So we asked employees to imagine that they work at a firm where they work closely with a direct manager whose evaluation determines the pay raise that they would receive at the end of the year. They were asked by their manager to review their department's past fundraising events and draft an event proposal for next year. Hosting the event is one of the most important projects of your departments. You want to do a good job. This is your second time planning the event, so we made sure to build in some stakes, hold a constant experience, and make it a request between an employee and a manager as a first place to start. The proposal is due tomorrow and you're feeling highly pressed for time. You could ask your manager for an extension and adjust your deadline. RDV in this scenario is how comfortable would you feel making the request to your manager? And we looked at a series of mechanisms that are related to different aspects of impression management. So maybe people, and women in particular, are worried about seeming less competent or committed, intelligent, capable for asking for more time, given that how fast you do things in an organization is often seen as a proxy for competence and commitment. It's also possible, related to Jared's comment in the chat window, that maybe because women are busier, they just recognize it's going to come at a cost to themselves in the future. And so they don't want to ask for more time now because that's just going to make them busier in the future. And so I might as well just get it done right now. Maybe it's something that it's self-signaling to yourself that you're not able to handle the responsibilities of your job. And so we tested a variety of different mechanisms to really look at, in a correlational sense, what seemed to be the most predictive of the outcomes we're interested here. Again, our main predictor is gender, and we had a whole series of control variables that reviewers at various points asked us to put in. So we have a lot of things related to job control, rank at work, feelings of entitlement, manager perceptions of competence, etc. So here in the study, we replicate the main effect. Women on average felt less comfortable asking for an extension request in this scenario as compared to men. This held controlling for key covariates that I just reported on the previous slide. We also saw that women in general were worried about burdening other people with the request. This seemed to be the most explanatory factor here. Perceived competence, so thinking that your manager would think less of you, didn't seem to explain this link. Thinking that you would think less of yourself if you made this request did not explain this link. Thinking that you were more or less entitled to the deadline extension did not seem to predict this link. And then when we delved into the specific aspects of burden that seem to be driving the effect, we see that it's women's concern with burdening their team and burdening their manager in this scenario that was predicting extension request avoidance. It wasn't letting their team down, so it's something specific about burden. We have run some additional exploratory analysis showing that these perceptions of burden and self-conscious emotions seem to go together. So part of what seems to be going on is women worry more and feel more guilt associated with the idea of burdening a team member if they ask for more time. And that's driving this discomfort with asking for more time in these scenarios. Now, the will create stress for myself didn't seem to be an explanatory factor in this study. Neither did the variable that it would make it harder to balance work and personal. So at least in this study, we see some evidence it's more about this interpersonal concern than burdening yourself in the future. We've replicated this across a variety of kind of different instantiations or different ways of looking at this question. We've looked at more broader impression management concerns and replicated this basic effect. I showed you the more detailed mechanism studies. Our earlier studies have broader measures of impression management concerns, and we replicate with those broader measures. We also see that women are less likely to ask for more time when they're thinking about asking a same status colleague. That makes sense in light of the previous mechanism data that I presented, given that women are worried about burdening a manager or burdening a team member. So it doesn't really matter if they're asking a manager or they're asking a colleague. Those mechanisms still seem to be in play here. And the results also hold when employees are imagining male and female managers. So it doesn't seem to be driven by women thinking about male managers and worrying more about burdening them. Even when we hold constant the gender of the manager, we see the same effects in these scenarios. Now, it is possible that women's fears are well-founded, that managers actually do negatively evaluate them to a greater extent, especially when the request burdens the manager. So these two studies sort of look at what are the manager consequences of asking for more time and vary the gender of the employee who's making the request. So in the first study, we look at 872 managers. We asked them to imagine the scenario that I presented earlier, and then to rate how competent that employee would be, depending on, as compared, if they made an extension request as compared to if they did not. And they imagined having this interaction with an actual male or female direct report. So they listed all of the managers in the study had to have at least 3 direct reports, at least 1 male, at least 1 female. And then we randomly assigned them to imagine that a specific employee that worked for them made this request. And we don't see any relationship here between the gender of the employee that the manager was asked to imagine having made this request and the perceptions of competence of this employee. These are just the Bayes factors, which suggest more support in more evidence in support of the null of no gender difference. We also looked at whether there were differences or gender differences in the attributions that employees or managers were making of employees for making these requests, including a lack of skill, lack of motivation, or thinking that maybe, for example, a female employee was more likely to be asking for more time because of personal responsibilities that might downstream signal that they're less committed to their job and more committed, for example, to their family. We don't see any evidence that managers made more negative attributions when they imagined that their female employees were asking for more time in this scenario as compared to their male employees. If anything, the results go in the opposite direction, whereby managers penalize male employees for asking for more time to a greater extent, and we're more likely to think that male employees lack skill and motivation, and that's why they were asking. So we don't see any like gender differences in attributions, potentially explaining more negative evaluations of women. Now, it is worth noting that all of these kind of like tightly controlled scenarios are contexts where deadlines are explicitly adjustable. There's little or no interdependence between the work of the manager and the employee, and no obvious negative repercussions associated with the extension request. This decision, we think, provides a conservative test of our research question: if women are less likely to ask for more time in situations that incur relatively fewer costs than men, it's also unlikely they would make costlier requests. But of course, managers can incur costs from granting deadline extensions, such as when the request meaningfully alters your, as the manager's, work schedule. So we wanted to kind of simulate a costlier deadline extension request situation and see on the manager side if there was any negative judgments based on gender when the request was costlier. To set up this situation, we recruited students to be randomly assigned to a role of a manager. This was actually, okay, so that kind of fun. We had a postdoc put together this kind of chat platform, and people thought they were interacting. It was very believable. People thought they were interacting with another participant, but in fact, they were interacting with a chatbot. And all participants were assigned to the role of a manager. They were paired with this other participant who was assigned to the role of associate. The manager was asked to review and submit the employee's work. So managers and employees were working on this task jointly, which is consistent in an organizational context. The manager might review an employee's work, but ultimately their boss is going to evaluate the final product. So that was similar here. The manager and employee worked together on 3 puzzle tasks, and they could earn up to 75 cents a round. So I'm just going to show you gender was manipulated. They had a little get to know you task where they shared information about each other at the beginning of the study. Managers, our participants here, were told that they were either matched with Alex and their avatar looked like this, or they were matched with Alex and their avatar looked like this. So we're really trying to control out differences such that the only difference here was just what gender participants identified with. But their skill level was the same and the role was the same. In this scenario, the chatbot or the participant, the employee, was sent the first word scrambles, and the manager had to wait while the employee did the task. So participants, if you're a participant in the study, you have to wait for this employee to do the task for a minute, which is like real life. You're usually waiting on your employees to do stuff for you. And then at the end of the minute, this total task duration is 2 minutes. At the end of 1 minute, which is how long they initially had at the beginning, participants then asked the manager or the participant in the study for more time. So they were asked if they could have another 30 seconds. We strongly encouraged the participants to grant that 30 seconds. So remember that your associate is allowed to ask for more time, and this request should be granted, right? So we're trying to hold that constant. And then at the end of this 30 seconds, with 30 seconds remaining, the manager participants were either seeing a participant that had completed the task entirely, or they had an employee's work task where the work task was only half done. And that was obviously the burden condition. So in 30 seconds remaining, the manager had to review all of the words to make sure they were real words, and now complete half of the employee's work for the employee who just seemed to have not completed it, even though they asked for an extension. So in order to get the 75-cent bonus, the participant had to, in 30 seconds, complete these additional word scrambles in the burden condition and check the work of the participant. So what we observed across the study, at the end of the study, then managers rated the perceived competence of this employee. The manager also rated how much this employee should get as a bonus. So what we saw at the end of the study is that there is a significant main effect of burden. Managers didn't think the employee was as competent when they didn't complete the word scramble. So that's very sensible given the protocol. And we see no effect of gender on these perceptions. So the null effect of no effect of gender was 8 times more likely to have generated the data that ended up seeing a significant gender effect. We also saw that a similar effect for bonus amounts, such that there's a main effect of burden. If you burden the manager more, you deserved less of a bonus at the end of the study, but there was no interaction with gender. And so here, H0, no gender differences, was 5.5 more times likely to have generated the data. So we see some evidence here across these two studies that even in the case of having a burdensome deadline extension request, that women are not penalized more by managers. And so then we wanted to look at whether we could essentially encourage women to ask for more time, or at least ask for time at equal rates as men, by implementing a formal policy. So in the first study, so these should be taken with a grain of salt. And if you know any organizations that want to run this in the field, please send them my way. So the first study is a classroom, which is my collaborator's classroom. It's undergraduate business students, about 57% female undergraduates. In the informal policy condition, where it's not a clear institutionalized policy that you can ask for more time, students were assigned to submit a discussion paper with 20% of their grade. We reminded students that if you need more time, you can email the instructor. And on the syllabus, it also said if you need an extension, you can email me to request one, but this isn't a formal policy. It's something sort of informal, mentioned a couple of times, but not in a systematic way. We see that in this one classroom where my colleague implemented, didn't have a formal policy, we see that men were significantly more likely to ask for more time as compared to women, consistent with our earlier studies. So women were 32% less likely to ask for more time. And the extension request significantly impacted grades. So to the extent that women asked less, they also were missing out on the opportunity to improve their grades. And these results held controlling for baseline GPA and other factors that might vary and potentially explain this difference. In study B, we had a classroom that had a formal policy, same institution, different context. This is why this is imperfect field data, but I'll present it nonetheless. So students had a final exam to study for that was worth 25% of their total grade. Students in this class could request for more time to study for their final exam by emailing an institutional form to their instructor and rescheduling their exam at a later date. This was the form, very formal. Here we see no gender differences. In another classroom context, this time different institution, all students in this institution were entitled to 4 24-hour extensions on assignments. They had to complete a form. And what was a nice design feature of this, from my perspective, is that this form didn't go directly to the professor. So they weren't emailing the professor directly, they were emailing an administrator, and that administrator then notified the instructor. So it took out this, to the extent that any of the differences in gender are based on this impression management concern, it sort of took that off the table here, or maybe changed the perception of it. So we see that in this classroom context, there was, again, no gender differences in making one extension request, and women and male students made similar extension requests during the year on various class assignments. So this provides some suggestive evidence that formal policies might mitigate this gender difference. We then ran a follow-up study where we randomly assigned Harvard College students to imagine that they were in the very first study where they had an assignment where 20% of their grade due, and they had that informal policy where they could email the instructor to ask for more time if they needed it. We saw significantly higher impression management concerns for women in that condition. We then had another condition where we asked college students to imagine that there was a formal policy supported by the school that would allow them to ask for more time on their assignment if they needed it. In this condition, we see significantly lower impression management concerns among women, still there, but lower. And so this provides some suggestive evidence that what might be eliminating some of the gender differences we observed in our earlier studies is this reduction in impression management. So we see across these studies that women avoided extension requests and felt less comfortable making them than men, and that relational orientation, so there was another study, impression management concerns and perceived burdens, specifically worrying about burdening managers and employees in the earlier studies, seemed to predict this avoidance, and women's status did not mitigate this effect. So I've also, Hannah gave me this suggestion to look at status across these studies. And what we observe is a similar effect for status. So these are orthogonal effects where women are less comfortable asking for more time. Being from a lower SES background at work or in a college context also predicts the extent to which you're less likely to ask for more time. So lower SES, you're more uncomfortable asking for more time. Women are more uncomfortable asking for more time, but we don't see interaction effects. So it's not that being a higher status woman in an organization or an institution offsets or mitigates or protects against this unwillingness to ask for more time. We see two orthogonal effects going on, which might have different kind of mechanisms underlying them and might be a point of discussion when we open this up to questions. I think something that we also observed that might be of interest to this group is we did compare requesting more time to requesting more money in some follow-up work. And we see that women feel as uncomfortable asking for more salary related to a work project as they do asking for more time related to a work project. So there was no difference between those two conditions. Men are more comfortable than women in both cases asking for money and time. But what seems to be really driving the time related discomfort is these impression management concerns to a greater extent than salary negotiations. So we also see a similar effect when we're looking at help, advice, or support seeking. So women also report less comfort asking for help in addition to asking for time as compared to men, because they are worried about impression management. But still, we see the impression management concerns driving the time effects more than the help effects. So there seems to be something about asking for more time to the extent that you're worrying about that it's going to really burden someone else. That seems to be especially important for understanding why women avoid time requests. And they're more like, women are less likely than men to ask for advice or support in the college context that I was studying. However, the difference is less strong than looking at help and asking for time. So it seems something like conceptually time and help, to the extent that they have that burden component of the other person, seem to be something that women avoid to a greater extent. Now, a limitation of these data or their focus on tightly controlled lab studies or imperfect field studies. So I definitely need more research in organizational contexts. It's also worth noting that potentially in the college student context, we're not seeing strong differences in chore and childcare demands among college-age women, although I do have some data which suggests that college-age women were taking on more chores during the pandemic. But regardless, we see that formal policies only eliminate the gender gap in classrooms, but don't encourage women to ask more than men. So if it is true that women experience greater time stress and greater burnout, they should actually be asking at slightly higher rates than men to the extent that they have more burdens at home. And so a question is what other interventions might be effective at encouraging women to ask for the time resources that they need. Additional research should also further explore the long-term consequences. So Jared's point was sort of pushing on this too. It could be that there's negative evaluation consequences when you ask repeatedly over time. It's also possible that asking for more time has these kind of negative externalities at the team level if it happens on a regular basis. So how do you strike this balance between making sure what's good for the person isn't throwing the whole team off? How does this play out over longer time horizons, I think, is an interesting area of future research. I also wanted to just in the last couple of minutes before questions, share some new data moving beyond time requests. So as I mentioned in some of my preliminary pilot data, I do see that women are less likely to ask for help. as compared to men. And I was interested in understanding whether these gender differences might play out in other important contexts outside of just requesting for more time on deadlines. So I've been analyzing, and Hannah and I have been looking at this together, data from the National Survey of Student Engagement. It's a large, fairly representative sample of first-year and fourth-year students in US colleges. And we have a data set, Hannah and I, from 2019 of about almost 18,000 full-time first-year students. And we've been looking at the role of status and gender and predicting students' willingness to reach out to their faculty members for advice on their performance and general career support and conversations. So something that's consistent with the data that I presented earlier is I see in these data that female first-year college students are less likely to discuss course concepts, topics, or ideas with faculty members outside of class. They are not less willing to go and ask a faculty member for help if it's related to their grades, but they feel less comfortable having these more informal, open-ended conversations that maybe are the kinds of conversations that turn into an RA position or are more networking related, right? We see, so this is just the results I just said, we see no gender difference in discussing academic performance with a faculty member. So it really does seem to be these kind of more esoteric conversations that are a little bit less structured that women avoid. I will also say from a status perspective, we see first generation college students going to their faculty members more than non-first generation college students. And we're still trying to understand what's going on there because that's in contrast to the other data, which I just mentioned a few slides ago. Unfortunately, in these data, so we looked at what organizational factors might support women. And so there's a series of questions in the NSSE data that ask students to report how much do they feel like the institution provides support to help students succeed academically, uses learning support services, encourages contact among students from different backgrounds. And we see that institutions that are rated as more supportive on these dimensions increase men's willingness to reach out to faculty and discuss concepts, topics, or ideas, but do not impact women's willingness to reach out to faculty in this more informal way. So we see organizational supports support male first-year students and not female first-year students. And I think this is an important area to understand. It's an important applied context to think more deeply about these concepts. And these data further emphasize the importance of setting clear norms and policies to encourage time and help requests and informal conversations. So before I open to Q&A, I just want to acknowledge the funding that made this research possible, my awesome RAs and colleagues. And then here's the citations for some of the work that I've discussed today that have informed the presentation. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
This is really wonderful. I'm gonna, Jared, jump in. Please.
I assume you're laughing because I raised my hand a little too quickly.
Like immediately.
If you want to, Hannah, if you want to go first, please feel free.
Because we've been dying to get to your questions and then your hand went right up and I just said, yes, let's just, I was going to call on you even if you hadn't come right up. So please jump in. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much for sharing this research. It's really fascinating. I really like the rigor of the studies and the kind of originality of the topic that you're addressing across all the studies. My question has to do with, I kind of got at this a little bit in the chat, but not entirely because I was still kind of forming the question. But I'm curious about the ground truth here. So are women right to be doing this, having this sort of gender associated bias, or wrong to be doing this? And similar to that question, I'm wondering, you're kind of pegging the mechanism on impression management concerns, which can sometimes be considered like an egocentric or self-oriented behavior. Like, I don't want to make a bad impression on this person, so I'm not going to ask for an extension because it will hurt me. But I wonder if perhaps a concern for others or a communal orientation is like masquerading as an impression concern. So I know that asking for an extension will rock the boat and will create problems for all of my colleagues and all of my teammates and all of my community. And I don't want to do that. It has nothing to do with like, this is just a theory on my part. It has nothing to do with the effect it'll have on me being liked or disliked, but rather the effect it will have on my team. And it seems like one way you could get at that, and you almost got at this actually with the talking with an administrator, is what if it were completely anonymous? So what if you could ask for an extension, but nobody would have any way of knowing that you were the person who asked for an extension? If the effect holds under that circumstance, it would seem to be clear that it's other-oriented behavior. It has nothing to do with the effect this will have on you, on people's impressions of you and hurting you, but rather it's simply that you don't want to rock the boat, you don't want to hurt the team. And in that sense, I would say the ground truth is that the women are right. But basically, like, it's not a bad bias, it's actually a good bias that's making teams more effective. And I suppose you could, in an extreme case, measure team effectiveness with and without requests for extensions being asked and or granted.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I think the ground truth, I think there's a few things we need to pull apart still. So the ground truth of it, we have this other paper showing that in general, on average, managers care more about quality, and when working under deadlines, employees care more about speed. So there seems to be a little bit of a miscalibration where a manager actually most of the time would say they prefer an employee to take a little bit more time and produce higher quality work. But when employees are working under a deadline, all they can think about is the deadline. And they think that because they're anchoring on that deadline, that that's also what their managers are thinking about. And so I think in general, and we do see in our student data that their assignments get better. So to the extent that time is paying off for quality of work, and given that most employees overall, not taking gender into consideration, anchor too much on the deadline and not enough on quality, there is at least some argument to be made that women may be overcorrecting, right? So maybe it's possible that they could be asking more than they are, and because asking can produce better quality results in certain cases. But I think what you're also driving at is this distinction between individual and team performance. And so this is why we need like some org studies where we're like looking at deadline extension requests on teams, because even in the assignment case, that's an individual work. So it could also be that women are right, but they don't and they're taking this more kind of like communal orientation with them, even when they're working on individual tasks that really don't have any negative implication for the rest of the people on their team or their manager or anything.
Well,
and
for the
that's
professor.
And that's where they're like overcorrecting in the wrong direction. And so it could also just be like what tasks. So maybe deadline extension requests asking for one more day to turn in a slightly more polished deck when you don't have a client deliverable is better. And so asking for an extension request on an individual task is usually the right thing to do. But when it comes to team tasks, maybe it's asking for an extension is a bad thing because it throws the whole team cadence off. And so women are just sort of like thinking about this more holistic world, like they're thinking about the gestalt when they don't need to be, when they can just be focused on their individual tasks. So that I think you're pushing on a couple of things, which is like looking at the individual versus team, and also looking at independent and interdependent work, and kind of seeing like what is best practice for these extension requests. And then I love your idea of looking at whether the request is private or public. Like I love the idea that these like other concerns, like it might actually be self-interested, but it's just that women feel comfortable saying they don't want to burden someone else, but really they just don't want to look bad. Like it might just be a self-reporting thing. So I love the idea of looking at whether we still see those mechanisms in the case where they're only asking an administrator versus asking the person themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just a quick follow-up just to say that even though in experiments we can design situations where asking for a deadline extension has no negative effect on anyone whatsoever, I think it's not a crazy assumption for human beings to have that when someone sets a deadline, that deadline was there for some purpose. Even if you don't really understand what the purpose was, why wouldn't they have said it later if it could have been set later? So I still feel like the women are right. I can't get off of that. I can't get off of that assumption. Sorry.
Totally fair. Totally fair.
Can I put two fingers on that
Yeah.
too? Because, Erin Kelly, your colleague, Jared, has this book called Overload. And what it's a wonderful example of is actually a whole organization, like team, really at an organizational level, renegotiating norms and figuring out whether time pressure or quality is actually more important and what types of work arrangements enhance quality and well-being. Without like jeopardizing time, but relieving some of the more arbitrary time burdens. It's a kind of wonderful intersection, I think, actually. It's a lot of implicit negotiation in the structuring of that, but that would be, these are wonderful questions. Can I bring in next, also Elizabeth Good had a question, and then Ellen.
Hi. Yeah, so thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. Your data is amazing. I'm wondering just about the likelihood of like willingness to disclose this information and whether or not that impacts outcomes. I mean, I know that this is linked to pay, like your willingness to disclose pay and then anchoring pay negotiations based on that, but also in terms of your student data. If you're talking to your friends and they're going to see their prof, why wouldn't you, kind of thing?
Oh, interesting. So I haven't studied it in this context, but I think it's a really interesting thought to study. I mean, maybe even women don't know it's okay to ask in that first case because they simply talk about it less. They're less maybe like thinking about instrumentality in their relationships in a college context. And so they don't necessarily talk about, did you talk to your professor? And what did you talk to your professor about? So I love the idea of thinking about disclosure. I have looked at disclosure just related to busyness. And so I'm trying to think that these data are really recent, but we've been looking at whether women versus men are more or less likely to disclose how busy they are, and women are less likely to disclose their busyness around, especially to like their direct reports. So that could also create some of these like negative feedback loops where it's not okay to ask for more time. It's not okay to signal how busy you are because I'm especially don't want to signal how busy I am because I'm worried then that you won't come to me and ask me questions. And women, similar, I think conceptually, I hadn't put this together until this moment, but similar conceptually to at least some of the suggested mechanisms from earlier in the talk, it seems women are worried more about their team in general, and so are less likely to signal their busyness to their team members. Men seem to be strategically signaling busyness to get out of some of these non-promotable tasks. And we see in our data of management consultants that women's busyness, when they do signal it, is taken less seriously. So they're asked to do non-promotable tasks, even when they like this is women's perception, that they're asked to do non-promotable tasks even when they signal that they're busy. Whereas men don't report that to the same extent. So I think there's some interesting kind of like questions around who do we talk about our busyness, who do we talk about who we get support and advice and help from, that could be really interesting areas to follow up on.
Could I ask you a quick follow-up question to that before we go to the next one? And that is like, this also connects back to Jared's question about like, yeah, it's not, that's fine. It's not functional in this particular situation that you constructed, but could it be kind of more broadly functional? And one question is, have you looked at the differential stereotypes of men and busy men and women? And then also stereotypes of men and women, and also interesting, even like by men and women, of men and women who like miss deadlines. You know, I mean, there are these sort of norms of conscientiousness that are more feminine stereotypic. I mean, it just could be kind of interesting whether or not, you know, women are kind of accurately picking up on a general risk of being viewed in a particular way that may not apply within a certain circumstance, but maybe just sort of this floating learned experience.
Yeah, I haven't looked at like these other perceptions, but I think it could be really interesting. I've only like asked people about their own experiences and who they signal busyness to and whether they feel like it helps or hurts. I haven't looked at, you know, here's 2 employees and what do you think what are your perceptions of them based on whether they signal busyness. So I think that would be really interesting to pick up on some of these stereotypes you mentioned.
Ellen, can I go to you next?
I've been working as an executive coach of women across sectors for 25 years. And so I find your research very interesting and have a couple of observations from what I've found. I find that almost instinctively, women will move to the I don't want to burden people. And then upon reflection, they may think about how are they going to be perceived. But my non-research 2 cents is that the issue around burdening is enormous. And the second, when you were talking about busyness and how women take on so many more non-promotable tasks, I think my way of making sense of what I see is that women have a great difficulty in saying no to those kinds of tasks, whereas when I was working in corporate, the men far often are happier, find it easier to say no. And the third thing I'd say is that over the years, I've started saying to women, just cut back to 100%. From 150%. And that's the reaction I always get, is that the room or the individual laughs, which always tells me, you know, I'm hitting home on something. And so I think this need, and I'm not going to say where it comes from, but I don't know where it comes from, to really do above and beyond. So the how will I be perceived is about delivering even more than is expected, which makes asking for more time difficult. But I think that burden on others is something, you know, if I was doing some research right now, that's what I would want to pursue.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. I really appreciate it. I think especially around this difficulty in saying no, I think it does resonate. I mean, with the data that we're seeing from the management consultants that I was saying, that even if they wanted to say no, or they wanted to say, women wanted to say they were too busy, they feel like they might not even be taken seriously for trying to say no. So what's the point? Or it might have negative repercussions. So I feel like trying to understand that is also a really interesting angle. So thank you so much, Ellen. I really appreciate it.
Marcy, could I pull you in on this just because your question builds on Ellen's, and then I'm going to go back to some of the other questions. But Marcy, can you unmute, Marcy? Oh yeah, great.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just fascinating study. I'm sure anecdotally we all can go on for hours and hours and hours affirming everything that you found in the study. But my question is about learning how to delegate, and the process of learning delegation and breaking up jobs into sections and knowing how to delegate those sections, following up on that, et cetera, et cetera. To me, it's really a management skill that needs to be learned, whether you're a man or a woman, and that I think is a consideration. Moving up the corporate ladder, one needs to learn how to delegate. And where do you see that falling into what you've been, you know, studying more broadly?
Yeah, so there was a paper an AMJ paper by Akinola that I cited at the beginning of the talk that talks about the importance of delegating and how women are more reticent to delegate unless you frame the opportunity, like you frame the delegation as an opportunity for the other person that you're
I'm
going
so
to ask.
sorry. I'm so sorry. I was 10 minutes late today.
Oh, no, not at all. I think I really briefly skimmed over it. So I think this is a really important point. So building on your comment, I think, I mean, and it's also, I mean, to the extent that it ties with any of my new data on signaling, it could be that women in general feel less comfortable delegating, right? That's the past research, but maybe also their mentors, if they tend to have more female mentors, are also less comfortable delegating, so they observe it less. So they might not learn or have as many models to see what effective delegation looks like. So I think you're underscoring something that's really a critical competency, as you're suggesting, that might be something that through these informal kind of networking channels might, especially for women, might not get picked up on, to the extent that you're also being mentored by other women more, and they're delegating less. They might not talk about their delegation, and you might not learn how to delegate when you're moving up the ranks. And so it does suggest, and maybe other people on this call know if there's been research on training around delegation, but I think it's a critically important area and really interesting to think about.
It kind of relates back to Elizabeth's comment too, about the degree to which, gendered social networks may be communicating differential norms or information about what is negotiable. Marita, can I bring you in from, Karina's calling in from the Ukraine. It's doing really important work in the government there.
I'm on mute. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Ashley, for this incredible research. It's very interesting, and I'm a huge fan and supporter of formal policies because from the perspective of North European countries, we can observe that this balance between parental responsibilities and work-life balance is much more better than in Ukraine and Europe, other countries, and I guess in US. And there is index of happiness, world index of happiness, and these countries are at the top. So I think these formal policies can encourage people to use some flexibility hours, and it's very important. Yeah, I have a question about any gender differences between the sex of supervisors. Maybe it's easier for women to ask woman supervisor for extension because she could understand some responsibilities of family for family, children, and other stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'll comment on kind of both parts of your comment and then question. So we also have data, so similar to the data it sounds like you have, showing that formal policies can improve work-life balance. So we looked at the World Values Survey a couple of years ago, one of my students and I, and found that found a strong correlation between the extent to which you valued leisure over work and whether your country had social programs that enabled you, like paid vacation, paid leave, really strong workers' rights, and that predicted whether you felt like you could prioritize leisure versus prioritize work, and that leisure over work prioritization also predicted differences between countries in happiness. So it sounds like both of our data sets are complementary on that finding. And then we do have a little bit of not the most convincing evidence that gender didn't seem to play a role in one of our scenario studies. So it didn't seem like women were more comfortable asking a female mentor for an extension as compared to a male mentor, male colleague. But I think that those findings need to be substantiated in organizational context. But at least in the one survey that we conducted, we didn't see any effect of the gender of who you were asking on the effects that we observed.
Agnes, could I bring you in? You had a question about how one asks.
I was wondering if there was some research on whether it's the type of help women need more experiences. I've noticed that women tend to ask more in front of decision points, and that may have something to do with the guilt or trying to avoid the guilt of making a bad decision. And a little bit of what Jared mentioned, that the difference if it's a private or a public outcome of the woman's work. So I've seen people ask for help or women ask for help more often when it's between things that will be public or affect the customer or something like that. So I know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, these are great questions. So we have a little bit of data on the first point, which is, are they asking for more effortful, like, are they thinking about more effortful requests? And so that's explaining the gender difference in women being less comfortable asking for more time. We were thinking along the lines that you are, and we included questions like that in some of our scenario studies. And we can control for differences in how effortful the request is going to be, how helpful the request is going to be, how important the issue is that you might ask for a deadline extension, and don't see that there's any meaningful differences. And we don't see that those differences, like, we can control for those variables and still see that kind of mean effect of gender emerge, suggesting it might be part of the story sometimes, but at least not in the scenarios that we were using. But I think it's a great point. I really like this idea of looking at whether the help request is public or not. We don't have kind of a clear test of this, but I think it's a really important direction to really start to understand some of these more contextual factors that are driving women's reticence to ask for more time and for support.
Could I ask one, if I'm not cutting ahead of anybody, can I ask you a question about the gender stereotypicality of the context?
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, it struck me that one, I love your burden study. It's really cleverly designed. But word scrambles, that's a gender congruent task for women.
Mm-hmm.
You know, have you looked at either whether effects are more likely if it's, say, math problems as opposed to anagrams, and or whether or not again, going back to the stereotypes that people might have, like, does a manager respond differently if a woman is late turning in math problems than when she's late turning in a verbal task?
I don't know, but I feel like we should run that study because I guess the closest thing that we have is that our college student scenarios or like our college field studies. The first two studies are in business classrooms where women are slightly less represented. But we didn't get the professors' perceptions. We just have women being less likely to ask when there's no formal policy. And when there's a formal policy, men and women asking at equal rates. But it says nothing about the professor's perception about students based on that request. So yeah, I don't have data on that, but I really should rerun the burden study and manipulate this gender stereotypicality of the task. I think that's a really important extension that we haven't done.
That would be really fun. See if there's any other, I don't want to cut it. I have 100 questions, but I don't want to cut ahead of anybody else here. Can I go back to one other one? Let's fly. You know, I wanted to highlight something that I thought was so interesting also, that on your reducing ambiguity, I found it really interesting. And we've also seen this in pay studies, that if you just say, you can do this, you know, you can negotiate for pay, or it's fine, you know, you can negotiate for more time, that doesn't help, that's insufficient. And I find it so interesting from a theoretical perspective, because it's kind of like, I think, I don't think I didn't get it all along, but I think as we've looked, as the data is accumulated, I'm trying to think about, why does this work? Like, how does this fit with, you know, theories of strong and weak situations and ambiguity? It's like, to my mind, I think, if I'd love your reaction, to my mind, it's like saying to introverts, don't worry, you go around, talk to anybody you want at the party. You know what I mean? Like saying to introverts and extroverts, talk to anybody. You can walk up to anybody and say hello. And that the key thing about strong situations is that people are not only like given clear and specific instructions, but they have like the equal capacity to, equal incentives, motivation, and capacity to do it. And so in essence, it's not a strong situation. We're not really, and what I think is so clever about your testing of the intervention that relieves the social interaction is that then people really are like you've equalized the incentives, the perceived incentive structure from the engagement in the situation. I just find that super interesting, just for theoretical extensions of this.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I mean, my lay intuition before reading all of this research would be telling people would be enough.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, though, related to these questions that we're getting is like, we're not picking up on this in our studies, but obviously there is a mental model whereby the lived experience of women, for example, in these studies is such that I cannot simply ask and be granted. Like, why should I trust that I will be granted and treated fairly? And so there's also, like building on what you're saying, there's also, it's something that I still don't trust the situation. It's not just that I feel like I have personal difficulty doing it for these kind of in my mind reasons that I'm going to burden someone, but also I may be treated differently, or I don't trust that you're going to treat me the same. There's something about this situation that I don't feel is going to support me. And so I think that's also what's going on. Whereas when you have an institutional form and an institutional policy, you're like, well, I can point to that. And even if you don't treat me fairly, I can go back to this form, this institutional handbook, and then say, here is the evidence that you need to change that grade or change your reaction to what I just asked.
That's awesome. And I see we're getting nods from Marina too, in favor of the policies. So thank you all so much. What a rich conversation. Ashley, I learn every time I get to engage with you and your research. It's really such a gift.